Hello there. Good to see you again. Um, this is our second last day. This is Friday, the 17th of July, and we're just working our way through this week. Where is God in a coronavirus world? Um, this one's a wee bit more difficult to cover because we've actually covered some of it already. I take this as a compliment. I've actually been covering the right stuff, but we'll get to that in due course. Um, he's gone through the reality and the science and atheistic responses to the coronavirus. But he's saying if you're working on the basis that there is a loving God and Christians respond to the virus in a way that they would wish to, do what God wants them to do, he's saying love your neighbour is the first and foremost fundamental response for others. The thing that he drives home here is the thing that we have referenced at various points, but it's worth repeating. In a recent article entitled Christianity Has Been Handling Epidemics for 2,000 Years, Lyman Stone, a research fellow at the Institute of Family Studies and an advisor at the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence, wrote the following. Historians have suggested that the terrible Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, which might have killed off a quarter of the Roman Empire, led to the spread of Christianity, as Christians cared for the sick and offered a spiritual model whereby plagues were not the work of angry and capricious deities, but the product of a broken creation in revolt against a loving God. That's the theology that would suggest it wasn't, when you say we live in a fallen world, it's not just pointing to the fact that if you go back to Genesis, Adam and Eve disobeyed God and therefore broke the relationship between humanity and God. What it's saying is that break was far more comprehensive because the break was between God and creation. And so that's why bad things happen at a tornado level and a tsunami level, as much as they bring benefits, even at a virus level, we've looked at through this week, courtesy of Mr. Lennox. These things actually have beneficial effects in creation. But he's just saying that Christianity has long viewed things in creation that are bad, that cause death, as something, basically the world's part, in the same kind of parallel to the human acts of disobedience that we would refer to as sin in our life, even down to the way the world is in terms of creation. God doesn't really want this. It's turned out this way, but it's a consequence of it being a fallen world. But the most famous epidemic is the plague of Cyprian. An aside, it's just the fact that the present incumbent in the White House loves to focus on the fact that this particular virus is the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, and that's often interpreted as being quite racist to name a virus after a particular region or country. These are plagues named after people. Antonine was a Roman emperor. But do you know who Cyprian is? Well, we find out. The most famous epidemic is the plague of Cyprian, named for a bishop who gave a particularly colourful account of this disease in his sermons. And you think I'm bang on a bit about the pandemic. Here's a guy that the most medical knowledge that we have of this particular pandemic comes from this man's sermons. Probably this virus was a disease related to Ebola. Well, it really would have been colourful. A plague of Cyprian helped set off the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman world. But it did something else too. It triggered the explosive growth of Christianity. Cyprian's sermons told Christians not to grieve for plague victims who live in heaven, but to redouble efforts to care for the living his fellow bishop Dionysius described how Christians, heedless of danger, took charge of the sick, attending to their every need. Now, that's Christians, the bishop, speaking about Christians. But what's really interesting is the next bit, because Emperor Julian, well, he wasn't a Christian, but listen to this. Nor was it just believers who took note of this reaction of Christians to the plague. A century later, the actively pagan Emperor Julian would complain bitterly of how the Galileans, Christians, would care for even non-Christian sick people, while the church historian Pontianus recounts how Christians ensured that the good was done to all men, not merely the household of faith. He then goes on to quote, oh, Kings, what could it be? Oh, Martin Luther, but you're safe. I think we've done Martin Luther enough, but he quotes him as well. But he does quote one thing, which I realise I wasn't aware of, because Martin Luther didn't put it in his pamphlet. Lennox here writes, Martin Luther refused calls to flee and protect himself. Rather, he stayed and ministered to the sick. I think you probably knew that already. The refusal to flee cost his daughter Elizabeth her life, but it also resulted in a pamphlet where the Christians should flee the plague. Love your neighbour is such a basic component, whether it's John Lennox, whether it's Martin Luther, or whether it's anybody in between, indeed ancient fathers as well, when the church was just beginning. I want to put it in some context. I was speaking, I better not say to who, but basically they were just saying that Flemington Hallside was a caring church, and then she told me the name of one person who had gone with walks for her, social distancing, but they had gone for a walk because this woman needs to get out, and somebody else had delivered shopping to her, and somebody else, this was specifically pointed out, somebody else had delivered to her a people's friend on a regular basis. Being neighbourly, if we're going to say, as Martin Luther did, having something like the NHS is a good thing and we should pay into it, then once that is done, that is the Christian responsibility to look after your neighbour at a scientific medical level. But what we have to do to love our neighbour is to not go and visit them, because we have the chance of infecting them, especially if they're old. But what we do have to do, and I mention it specifically because it's what folks have done, is deliver the medicine, deliver the groceries, deliver the people's friend. That probably meant more. You know who you are, so thank you to you too. It's all those things that go to make love your neighbour a reality. And that is what Christians have to do. The thing is, nowadays, you need to be really upfront and clear. Unlike Emperor Pagan Julian, I don't think anyone's going to single out Christians nowadays, because there's lots of people. But that is because of the last 1,000 years, 1,500 years worth of influence, where the very definitions of what counts as good are Christian definitions. We have more than a millennia of people trying to do the right thing and defining it in a Christian way. And now, helping your neighbour is the defining thing. We're not meant to run away. And so we give thanks, not just for the folks who are in the NHS, but those who don't run away. And there have been many nurses and doctors who have died and who have been hit very hard by the virus when they've caught it themselves. My point is, this basic response to pandemic is a bit more obvious, or it feels like it, to most people, because the Christian influence has been in this part of the world for the better part of a millennia and a half. I'm not suggesting, not even close to suggesting, that only Christians can and do help their neighbour. If the pandemic in 2020 has shown anything, everybody does it now. But why? It is plainly not the human response that everybody has. And what I'm suggesting is, when you read this, not just in terms of the medicine and the science, but also the history and the psychology, you begin to recognize the very reaction of our country to put people first and to look after their neighbour points you towards the fact that the Christian faith has been in place in this country, and ethically, in terms of the way people think, still is, and it's been here for centuries. Give thanks for that. And when people are tempted to tell you with fulsome, both barrels, lungs to the full, about how we are a post-Christian country and all these things don't mean anything anymore because we've moved on from faith, psychologically, we are still going through with the residue and the kind of psychological baggage, positive, of what we have in the past, i.e., just a straightforward focus on defining what the right thing to do is by help your neighbour. Thank you for doing what you have done already, because I realise people have been doing it. And recognise that when the pandemic officially stops, there will be an awful lot of people who need you to be a neighbour to them as well. Do that for Christ also when you have the opportunity. Meantime, you can say it because you know what I'm going to say. The fact is, even though you know I'm going to say it, it still makes it worthwhile saying. Go with God, because God goes with you. See you tomorrow for the last time, at least in this context. Good to see you. Bye.